Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see you all back here for our conference and our special session this afternoon on archaeology and history. I am not Kyle McCarter. I am Tom Levy. Kyle couldn't make it. And it really gives me great pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Professor Yisrael Finkelstein, my dear friend and colleague in Levantine archaeology. Yisrael is the most prominent and controversial biblical archaeologist in the world today. Thanks to Israel Finkelstein, our field of historical biblical archaeology is vibrant, engulfed in positive scholarly debate, and engaged with the public around the world. I know this well. He has criticized every single article I have written about the Iron Age. Yisrael, in 2005, won the Dan David Prize of $1 million, which he shared with Professor Graham Barker from Cambridge University for his work in Levantine archaeology. Israel Finkelstein is professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University, where he has served in a variety of positions, including director of the Sonia and Marco Nadler Institute of Archaeology from 1996 to 2002, where he helped guide Tel Aviv University archaeology into the world center of research and publication that it is today. Israel has published hundreds of scholarly articles and over 10 books, most notably The Bible Unearthed, Archaeology's New Vision of Ancient Israel and the Origin of its Sacred Text, and David and Solomon in Search of the Bible's Sacred Kings and the Roots of the Western Tradition, both with Neil Silberman. Over the past 3 years, together with Professor Steve Weiner of the Weizmann Institute of Science in Rehovot, Israel, Professor Finkelstein has been the co-principal investigator of a 3.2 million euro, I think that's the amount, grant devoted to applying the sciences and scientific methodologies to biblical archaeology. So please join me in giving Israel Finkelstein a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Tom. And before I start, and please don't think that this is a mutual adoration society, I must tell you that I really congratulate you for this wonderful facility, for the amazing exhibition, and for the work which you have been doing in Wadi Fanan. I think, and I said it more than once, that the work on the copper at Wadi Fanan is the single most important project being conducted in the Levant today in the archaeology of the Levant. So, Tom, thank you for this. I will start with the short introduction. Scholars who attempted to deal with the historical reality behind the Exodus and desert wandering narrative are divided into two camps. Members of one adhere to the traditional notion that the biblical material portrays the situation in the 13th century BCE, the time calculated according to the logic of biblical chronology. They face two major problems. First, it is clear today that there was no significant scribal activity in ancient Israel until around 800 BCE. Hence, they need to assume an oral transmission of the story over a period of 4 centuries with no infiltration of realities from the time past. Second, there is no evidence to support the late Bronze origin of the tradition, which cannot be also put on the background of other later periods. Members of the second camp propose that the text describes realities which fit the time of compilation, in late monarchic to post-exilic times. Their main difficulty is how to explain the strong tradition of both Exodus and the desert experience in the writing of northern prophets of the 8th century BCE. Here I wish to look at the subject from the side of archaeology, mainly to deal with the wilderness wandering material through the lens of toponyms which appear in the narrative and the itinerary lists. Nothing happens. Nice sound. Okay, I'll go from here.
Got it. You got it.
No, I got it from here. It's okay. Where am I? Yes. The latter, that is to say the itineraries, have been studied intensively regarding issues such as structure, sources, reductions, and geography. Yet the question of historical reality behind them has seldom been addressed. In other words, though the itinerary lists belong to late reductions of the Pentateuch, for reasons which will be explained later, they are probably based on earlier sources. I wish to ask the following question. What could biblical authors of different schools and times know about the southern desert? This question becomes especially acute when one looks at the settled lands. Late monarchic, exilic, and post-exilic authors were well acquainted with the geography of Judah, Yehud, and adjacent areas. But even for the not too far regions, such as the northern Gilead and northern Samaria, their knowledge was fragmentary. If this were the case for regions close to the world of the authors, how about the desolate and remote desert areas located hundreds of kilometers away? What could have been the source of knowledge about them? The desert itineraries were the subject of intensive research, including treatments of sources. Scholars, the most notable among them Martin Knott, assumed that the itineraries were based on materials earlier than the final reductions. One way to reveal these early materials and their background is to look at the archaeology of places mentioned in the narrative and lists which can be securely identified. If one puts aside the northeastern delta, south of Moab, there are only four such places. Kadesh Barnea, which you see in the picture, Etzion Geber, Tel el-Khalefe between Aqaba and Eilat, Punon, Khirbet Fenan, where Tom is now working, and the land of Edom. Two additional sites in the south have the potential of shedding light on the question posed here regarding the acquaintance of biblical authors with the southern desert. En Hatzeva in the eastern Araba, and Kuntilat Ajrud in northeastern Sinai. The analysis below very much depends on the archaeology of these sites. So what did biblical authors know about the southern desert? Let me start with the period of the latest reductions of the text by priestly or post-priestly scribes in the Persian period. The sparsely settled and demographically depleted province of Yehud stretched no farther than Bet Sur in the south. There was no Jewish presence in the southern Hebron Hills or the Beersheba Valley. And though several Persian period sites have been recorded in the Negev highlands, activity at key sites in the south was weak. Kadesh Barnea lost its importance. Tel el-Khalefe too seems to have declined, and Hatzeva was not inhabited. There is no evidence for significant Persian period presence at Wadi Fenan, and activity on the Edomite plateau was weak. Under these circumstances, knowledge of priestly authors regarding the southern desert must have been fragmentary at best. The toponyms which appear in the wandering narrative and the itineraries can hardly represent, therefore, Persian period realities. This means that the biblical materials discussed here are based on earlier sources, as indeed suggested by Knott and others. In the following minutes, I wish to try identify the background for these possible sources step by step from late to early. In the closing decades of its history, after the Assyrian pullout from the region, Judah was still strongly present in the Beersheba Valley. Farther to the south, the Judahite fort of Kadesh Barnea, in blue on the picture, continued to function after the withdrawal of Assyria. This is attested by Hebrew ostraka, which best fit a date around 600 BCE, and several contemporary Arad ostraka, which seem to refer to Judahite military units that moved in the desert. There are enough clues then that Judahites were well acquainted with the desert until the destruction of the kingdom. The importance of Judah as a participant in the Arabia Trade Network is manifested in the recently published circa 600 BCE Sabaean inscription, now on the screen, which refers to, and I quote, the towns of Judah, unquote. The Assyrian century, I'm going one step back, the Assyrian century evidenced the strongest Judahite activity in the southern desert. Assyria shifted the main Arabian trade route from the difficult to control, arid and isolated Darb el-Raza to the Edomite Plateau and the Beersheba Valley, which were dominated by the vassal kingdoms of Edom and Judah. This was the time of peak prosperity in the Beersheba Valley. The towns and forts there, and especially markets and khans, such as the one unearthed at Aroer, were places where Judahite merchants and administrators met Edomites and Arabs. Information about the south could have been transmitted also by Arab merchants who visited Jerusalem. Beyond the Beersheba Valley, the Assyrian controlled the desert trade routes from 4 pivotal strongholds. Kadesh Barnea in the east, a Judahite fortress which was probably commissioned by Assyria in order to guard the movement of people and commodities along the Darb el-Raza, the large Assyrian fort at En Hatzeva, and the large massive wall fort at Tel el-Khalife, I'll get back to it later, which were probably manned by local people, Edomites, Arabs, and possibly also Judahites, and the imperial center built at Busera in Edom. At Kadesh Barnea and possibly also in Hatzeva, Judahites could meet locals and collect information about places and routes in the deeper desert. Judahites who served in the Assyrian administration could have traveled to more distant places such as Busera and Tel el-Khalife. This knowledge of the desert finds expression in a variety of biblical references. Ezekiel's description of the southern border of Canaan is based on 2 points of reference, in the east and west, Tamar, that is En Hatzeva, and Kadesh Barnea, respectively. Here they are, the two of them. Attention should also be given to the detailed geographical knowledge expressed in the description of the southern border of the tribe of Judah. Knowledge of the south is also reflected in Genesis 14. This chapter is made of several layers, and part of it is late in date, in fact, possibly as late as the Hellenistic period. But the military campaign itinerary seems to portray the reality of the Assyrian century. The description is based on the 3 well-known spots in the south, El Paran, that is Elat, Kadesh, and Tamar. Scholars noted a possible connection between the route of the Genesis 14 campaign and the desert wandering in opposite direction. Needless to say, the story about the refusal of the king of Edom to let the Israelites cross his territory in Numbers 20 should also be anchored in the late 8th to early 6th centuries, the only time in the Iron Age and Persian period with a strong kingdom in this area. This brings me to pre-72 BCE years, probably the most interesting, and to what I consider as the most tantalizing question: the origin of the strong Exodus desert tradition in the northern kingdom, as expressed in the prophecies of Hosea and Amos. The key site for addressing this issue is Kuntilet Ajrud, and more specifically its association with the northern kingdom. Recent radiocarbon determinations support previous observations, also based on radiocarbon, that the site dates to the first half of the 8th century BCE, that is, to the days of Jeroboam II. The Kuntilat Ajrud finds indicate that in the first half of the 8th century, Israel dominated the desert trade route along the Darb el-Raza. Inscriptions and drawings unearthed at the site point to the strong involvement there of an Israelite monarch, most probably Jeroboam II, to the extent that Talai Ornan recently suggested that the site was a royal trade station. Cult at Kuntilat Ajrud seems to have been devoted to Yahweh of Teman, that is, Yahweh of the southern arid zones, and Asherah, Asherat, according to Naaman. The reference to Yahweh of Samaria should probably be understood as an appeal to the protection deity of the capital, compared to Yahweh of Jerusalem in the Beit Lei inscription. As noted by Otmar Keil, Konrad Schmidt, and others, the inscription may in fact refer to a temple of Yahweh at Samaria, which may also be hinted at by Hosea 8:6. The northern kingdom had two foundation myths, charter myths, according to van der Thurn: the Jacob cycle and the Exodus wandering narrative. The early layer of the Jacob stories dealt with foundation of temples at Penuel and Bethel. This tradition was evidently promoted in these two cult places. Was there a cult place directly related to the Exodus wandering tradition? This tradition too could have been venerated at Bethel, as suggested, for example, by Dozman. The temple of Yahweh at Samaria is another option. Konrad Schmidt proposed that this temple had cultic literature of its own. Now, as far as I can judge, it is impossible to control the southern trade without commanding the head of the Gulf of Aqaba, where the two main routes leading to the Mediterranean split. I have recently taken a fresh look at the finds of Tel el-Khalifa and reached the conclusion that the square casemate fort there, the early of the two fortifications, dates to the first half of the 8th century. This is based on close reading of the pottery items found at the site and their provenance. This fort could have been erected by Israel or Judah in the service of Israel. Its construction and/or activity at a nearby site may provide the reality behind 2 Kings 14:22, which reports that Uzziah built Elat and restored it to Judah. This text speaks about a period not too remote from the time of the authors, and so I doubt if it can be regarded as reference based on later realities. In restored, the author probably refers to the ahistorical earlier verses in 1 Kings, which speak about activity of Solomon and Jehoshaphat in this region. Azariah was probably a vassal of Jeroboam II. This situation of an Israelite site with a certain connection to Judah is also reflected in the finds of Kuntilat Ajrud. On this background, it is clear that people from the northern kingdom, including Samaria officials and merchants, must have frequented the site of Kuntilat Ajrud in particular and the Darb el-Raza in general. There, they must have met local nomads who were involved in the southern trade. From their own experience and from these contacts, those Israelites must have learned about places and routes in the deep desert, mainly those located between the head of the Gulf of Aqaba and the Mediterranean coast. This is the place to mention toponyms which appear in the Hebrew Bible only in the Numbers 33 list. That is, they are absent from the narrative in Exodus Numbers and from the Deuteronomy Itineraries, and are not mentioned in any other biblical text. None of them, except for Punon, can be identified. These place names probably come from a different, independent, possibly northern 8th century BC source. Whether they originally belonged to a pilgrimage itinerary as suggested by Knott, as early as 1940, and others, whether such an itinerary was connected to the story of the journey of Elijah to Horeb in 1 Kings 19. Very complicated, I'm not going to go into this. And whether such a pilgrimage route was related to Kuntilat Ajrud, all this is impossible to say. One thing seems clear. These sites were not any more relevant to Judahite scribes in the 7th century BC. This is as far back as one can go with an answer to the question I posed in the beginning of this paper. What, how, and when did biblical authors know about the southern desert? And this is also the end of this part of the presentation, and the shorter part comes now. So from here, I'm moving to the question of the roots of the Exodus wandering tradition. It should be clear that Hosea and Amos did not invent the Exodus desert tradition. So what was the source of this tradition in the northern kingdom in the 8th century BCE? How far back could one trace it? Attempts to isolate what I would call a moment in Egypt in the 13th century BC to fit the Exodus narrative are doomed to failure. So a more nuanced explanation must be sought. With no clear evidence, neither in the biblical text or Egyptian sources, nor in archaeology, we need to stride into the territory of historical speculation. Redford suggested that the Exodus tradition may have originated from the memory of the expulsion of the Canaanites from the Delta in the 16th century BCE. Naaman, following Ron Handel, recently proposed that the biblical story preserves the memory of oppression inflicted on the people of Canaan by the Egyptian administration in the late Bronze Age. Thomas Romer and Manfred Bitak looked for roots of the Exodus Moses tradition in the late Bronze Age. The problem with these theories is that they do not explain why the memory was preserved and promoted in the northern kingdom. The Shephelah and southern coastal plain make a more reasonable place. The reminiscence of an expulsion from the Delta at the end of the Middle Bronze should have been kept in the southern coastal plain and the area of the Besor. And hieratic inscriptions and other archaeological finds hint that economic oppression in the 12th century BCE was probably the severest in the southern lowlands. As for the north, Egyptian rule should have been strongly felt mainly in the valleys around Megiddo and Bet Shean, not in the highlands. The weak holding of Egypt in the late Bronze Age in the highlands is demonstrated by the maneuvers of Shechem, of Labayu, and his sons in the Amarna period. There is no hint for an Egyptian economic pressure in this region. In fact, the highlands, including the North Samaria hills, were relatively sparsely settled at that time. To sum up this point without rejecting the Redford, Naaman, Romer, Bitak ideas, in order to get a full picture regarding the origin of the Exodus tradition, one needs, in my opinion, to also look for a memory which is connected specifically to the northern highlands and its population, and which is preferably closer in time to the days of Hosea and Amos. In several recent articles, I discussed the role of Egypt of the 22nd dynasty, and more specifically the Sheshonq I campaign, in the decline of the first North Israelite territorial entity in the late Iron I, an entity which was centered in the area of Gibeah, north of Jerusalem, and which seems to have ruled over the entire northern part of the Central Highlands and the western Gilead. The Gibeah polity was replaced by the northern kingdom, which was centered in the area 15 minutes? I don't need 15 minutes. 50. I need only 5. How can you give me 50? You're generous, Tom. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
You're an old donkey trader.
Horse trader. So you know that you're not going to win this one anyway. Okay. The rise, so where were we? The Gibeah polity was replaced by the northern kingdom, which was centered in the area of Shechem Tirza. The rise of this entity, too, may have been related to the Sheshon campaign, possible involvement of Egypt in the history of Jeroboam I is hinted in the Septuagint version of 1 Kings 12, the well-known alternative story on the division of the United Monarchy. Scholars are divided regarding this text, whether reflecting a pre-Deuteronomistic source, as suggested by Schenker, or merely a late Midrash, Talshir and Sweeney. Memories of these events could have been preserved in the areas of both Bethel and Shechem, and they could have been embedded into earlier salvation from Egypt traditions from the lowlands, which were imported into the highlands when Israel expanded into the northern valleys. The salvation from Egypt tradition, to use an expression of Dozman, thus became one of the two founding myths of Israel. In the early days of the Northern Kingdom, it was still an oral tradition. There is no way to know if in this formative phase it included a component about the wandering in the wilderness. Summary. Let me summarize what I have proposed for the development of the Exodus wandering tradition now from early to late. So I'm going now in the different direction, the opposite. The beginning could have been rooted in the salvation from Egypt tradition that were traditions that were popular in the lowlands of Canaan, which preserved vague memories from the second millennium BC. These memories were imported to the Samaria highlands when Israel expanded into the northern valleys, starting in the late 10th century BC. There they merged with more recent Egyptian memories from the time of the 22nd dynasty's involvement in the northern part of the Central Highlands. The next phase of the evolvement of the Exodus desert tradition came in the beginning of the 8th century, with the unprecedented prosperity of Israel, including territorial hegemony in the southern lowlands and presence along the desert trade routes. The finds of Kuntilet Ajrud best represent this phase. The site was directly connected to the interests of the royal court and was therefore frequented by Israelite administrators and merchants, who thus became acquainted with places and routes in the wilderness. This was the time and background for the first appearance of an Exodus desert tradition in a written form in Hosea and Amos, and possibly in a text found at Kuntilet Ajrud if we follow a recent article by Naaman, well, not published yet. Part of the desert itinerary in Numbers 33, a block with names of places which do not appear in any other text in the Hebrew Bible, may have originated in this period. The Exodus wandering tradition migrated to Judah after 720 BC, so also Hoffman. Archaeology testifies to dramatic growth in Judah in the Iron 2B, in the number of new settlements, size of existing settlements, and population. This cannot be explained as natural growth and must reflect movement of people from Israel to the south after the fall of the Northern Kingdom. These Israelites brought with them to Judah northern traditions, including the Exodus wandering narrative. It was elaborated on and transformed in the period of Assyrian domination over Judah. Elements in the life of Moses and strands of anti-imperial ideology seem to characterize this phase, as suggested by Otto, Romer, and Schmidt. At that time, Judah took part in the organization of and control over the Arabian trade routes on behalf of the Assyrian Empire. Judahites were stationed in outposts beyond the southern border of the kingdom, and hence Judah developed detailed knowledge of the desert. Part of the wandering narrative and the associated itineraries should be affiliated with this phase in the history of ancient Israel. The importance of Edom on the biblical map of the south reflects the reality of this period. The withdrawal of Assyria in the second half of the 7th century brought about a change in the geopolitical situation in the region. Much of the area which had been dominated by the Assyrians was now ruled by the 26th dynasty in Egypt. Judah and Egypt, each with its own goals of territorial expansion and Golden Age ideology, were now on a collision course. The Exodus story, especially the victory of Yahweh over the Pharaoh, served well the ideology of Judah in the days of King Josiah, as a fable about the past and a prediction regarding the future. Realities of Egypt in the time of the 26th dynasty, when Judahites lived in the Delta, could have also influenced the continuing elaboration of the Exodus tradition as suggested by Redford and Van Seters. The geopolitical realities which facilitated knowledge of the desert in Judah disappeared at the end of the Iron Age. All the large desert fortresses were abandoned and Edom declined after 560 BC. Priestly scribes who lived in Jerusalem in post-exilic times had no knowledge of the arid regions in the south. But the Exodus and wandering narrative continued to develop. The ongoing compilations, elaborations, and reductions of the Persian period were strictly literal. But they resonated well with the concerns of the time, mainly the exodus from exile in Mesopotamia. The Exodus wandering tradition, as we know it today, is therefore the final product of many centuries of accumulation and growth, first oral and then written, with a complex history of reductions in the light of changing geopolitical and historical realities. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great lecture, Yisrael. I'm not sure where the speculative history part began, right? You mentioned that. So the one thing I wanted to say was the problem of dating about Edom. I'm just going to run this by. You said it was like the earliest Edomite kingdom was in the late Iron Age, and I think we've shown that there was a local complex polity there, probably an early form of a kingdom in the 10th century. But so that was just the remark I wanted to make, and I think I'll open it up to...
On this we don't agree, and it's okay.
It's okay, right.
Yeah.
So Ron and then Bill.
Yes, thank you for that brilliant paper. I want to, maybe this is because we're in San Diego where Noel Friedman used to be, or maybe it's because I'm a student of Frank Cross, but I want to throw in the Song of the Sea. Several people have mentioned that the earliest textual representation of the Exodus is in Hosea and Amos. But I think it's fair to say that a good case, perhaps a compelling case, could be made that the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15 is actually the oldest datable text that mentions the Exodus, in which case the idea that it's originally a northern tradition as such gets muddied. So I just want to throw that in. I'm sure you've considered it, but I just want to throw that in.
The answer to your question is in the first half of your question. In the course, tradition, David Noel Friedman, and so on, there's a big debate about the dating of this text, and this is not something solid that you can really build on. It reminds me always, the biblical scholarship, with all due respect, on the Song of Deborah, dated by some to the late Bronze Age and others to the Hellenistic period. So where am I standing as an archaeologist who knows about pottery? Wait, Ron, just a minute. So I need to put myself on solid grounds. I think the Assyrian century in the south, or Kuntilet or Drud, or the situation in the Northern Kingdom in the first half of the 8th century is as far as you can go back with solid grounds. The rest is speculation, of course. I admit, and I said it up front. So if you wish to put in another speculation, that's okay. But it's a speculation also.
No, I disagree.
Okay. So we have another disagreement here.
Professor Deaver.
Unfortunately, I agree with most of what you said.
Something is wrong here. Something is wrong.
Two questions, however.
Bill.
How early would you date your Gibeonite polity? And although I know the answer already. And why are you so determined to anchor the early phase of the tradition in the north?
Again, what was the second part?
Why do you want so much to anchor the early phase of the tradition in the north?
Well, let me answer first of all the first part. I would date the earliest North Israelite polity. If you wish, you can call it the House of Soul. That's okay. I think there is enough evidence that comes both from archaeology, especially now re-evaluation of excavations north of Jerusalem with evidence for casemate fortifications in several sites, all located in the same region. So there's enough from the side of archaeology and also from the evidence, as far as I understand it, that comes from the Sheshonq First campaign. So I would date it to the, how to say, very late Iron One. In absolute chronology terms, we are speaking here about somewhere in the first half of the 10th century, something like that.
Okay.
This is the first part of the answer. The second part, as I said, the evidence leads both from the biblical side, the way I understand it when I look at Hosea and Amos, and when I look at Kuntilat Ajrud and the evidence provided by Kuntilat Ajrud. I think Kuntilat Ajrud is the single most dramatic piece of evidence for understanding the question, at least I'm not sure about Exodus, but the wandering in the desert. The wandering tradition, if you come to think of it, I mean, this is the only excavation, including the inscriptions, which provide you with real access to the world of the people who lived in the first half of the 8th century in the Northern Kingdom. And all the evidence at Kuntilat Ajrud, not only the language and the drawings, but also pottery-wise and other pieces of information, they all lead to the Northern Kingdom. So it calls for some sort of a different evaluation of the situation in the south at that time.
Yeah, if it depends on a northern connection of Ajrud, I agree.
Okay, Professor Hoffmeyer.
Well, I just wanted to raise a methodological question, James Hoffmeyer, a methodological question, because Ron here makes a very good point that we're all familiar with, and you looking at the archaeological data, I think this shows us why what we're talking about really requires an integration of these two areas rather than divorcing and saying, well, we can only say this because of archaeology, or we can only say this because of text, and somehow have to bring these two together in a dialogue, to use Bill Deaver's word. And I think that's the gap we're seeing here, that we need to somehow bridge that gap. But that's just a comment. But thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Gary?
Thank you, Tom. Gary Rensburg. I don't always agree with my friend and colleague Ron Hendel, but he's absolutely correct on this one, on the dating of Shirat Hayam and Shirat Devorah. And
wait until I bring my forces. They are sitting on the third row.
Right. So Yisrael,
believe me, they are strong.
For you to simply quote
Thomas, you want to rise and shine?
For you to simply quote those scholars who've analyzed the language of those two poems and suggest that they come from the Hellenistic period.
No, I didn't say that. I say that when you go and read what people are writing about, this or that piece of literature, you get a spectrum of ideas from two.
As you do when you look at archaeological strata, whether they're this century or that century, although the gap is smaller. But my question to you is the same one that I asked Bill Deaver yesterday. So you talk about an 8th century prophet, Amos, with perhaps something, none or whatever vague recollections of some Israelite past. But it's the same prophet who gets it absolutely correct on the Philistine origins in the Aegean. So how is it that that prophet is able to know that at a distance of 4 centuries, but can't know something about his own people's historical past?
I don't think that you get that. I mean, also yesterday I wanted to comment on your comment. I don't think that Amos knows about, or any biblical source knows about the Philistines of the Iron One. In my opinion, this is not the topic of this lecture, but I will say it because it's the second time that it is put on the table. The Iron One Philistines are not the Philistines in the Bible, and the Philistines in the Bible are not the Iron One Philistines, which means that the Philistines in the Bible are what the authors knew in the 8th, 7th centuries BC in the lowlands from their tradition and so on and so forth. The major question to ask is the following. Had there been a memory of the situation in the 12th century BC along the coast of Canaan, the two most important items in the reality of this situation are missing from the Bible. That is to say, the strong grip of Egyptian domination over the coastal plain and the northern valleys, and the settlement of other groups of sea people, such as the Sikila and the Sherdena.
Okay, with that note on the Philistines, thank you very much. Please.